Something that I talk endlessly about on this channel and in writing is the ongoing criminalisation of grassroots activism in Australia. And so I was really, really pleased to see what's called a declaration of our right to protest recently released. So it was penned by the Human Rights Law Centre, but around 60 local civil rights organisations joined that declaration as signatories. I love the declaration. I love the fact that it exists, and I really want to talk about it. So, who better to speak to than the person who I believe penned the thing? I've got senior lawyer David Mejia-Canales for the Human Rights Law Centre here. Thank you, David, so much for your time, mate. Thanks for coming on.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
First of all, can you go, David, I suppose, just into the background, behind the declaration? What led the HRLC to want to gather so many organisations together under the banner of, as point one, I believe the declaration says, protecting the right to protest in Australia?
Yeah, look, as you mentioned, Tom, like the very first point is that we must protect the right to protest because all governments have a duty to do that under international law. The right to protest, I like to think of it as a bit of a gateway human right, because without the right to protest, we can't actually expand our concept of human rights and the things that are important, the things that we need to protect. And protest has actually given us so many of the things that we take for granted. Everything from votes for women, First Nations, land justice, queer rights, and everything in between. Those things did not happen because politicians gifted them to us. They happened because people protested for them. What we've been seeing in the last 20 years or so is a really worrying erosion of the right to protest in Australia. This is across almost all jurisdictions. If you look at the last 20 years, there have been 34 different pieces of legislation introduced around the country to erode the right to protest, and 26 of those have passed. In the last maybe 5 or so years, we're really seeing a very big crackdown, in particular for climate activism and climate grassroots protest movements in particular. And the laws that have been introduced to sort of clamp down on those types of protests and activism, the fundamental feature of them is that they're really broad. They have really vague offences, and they have unbelievable punishments for those offences. Up to, $75,000 fine for blocking a road in South Australia, or, up to 6 months in jail for doing the same in New South Wales. So we're seeing a trend here, and the trend is not going in a way that is conducive to a good and healthy democracy. And this is why we needed to draw a line in the sand with a declaration of the right to protest.
You mentioned these draconian laws with ridiculous consequences, ridiculous penalties in them that are clearly meant to scare people away from even entering the field of activism, you'd think. And then in recent years, we've seen, in particular, we've seen direct actions that are definitely civil disobedience. Temporary blockage of roads and such, like those deployed by Blockade Australia or Extinction Rebellion, increasingly criminalised to that effect. Do you think that the government and police approach to activism has grown to become about discouraging Australians from even rallying at all?
I think that the data would suggest yes. And even, you don't even have to sort of take it from me. The previous Premier of New South Wales was just calling for the book to be thrown at activists who blocked one lane of the Sydney Harbour Bridge for 20 minutes, calling for action on climate change. This is unbelievable. They don't have the same level of concern for the amount of money that is donated to political parties from oil and gas companies. I'll sort of say that. But I think one of the things that we are seeing, though, is that politicians in particular, as well as the police, are creating a really toxic environment about what it means to protest, what it means to resist state oppression, what it actually means to voice your concerns in public. And that should worry every single person who values living in a democracy. That is not a sign of a healthy democracy when the government is demanding that you stop calling for action on climate change. That's the only fast action that our politicians can take, is to suppress dissent, calling for more action on their behalf. They don't sort of seem to be actually doing what is necessary, but just actually silencing people who are calling them out on that.
Point 3 of the declaration talks about how it says the mere act of organising or participating in a peaceful protest must not be criminalised under counter-terrorism laws. But, I feel like the call from many different elements of, increasingly so perhaps, of liberal Australian society is to criminalise activism. Like, we've seen that with environmental and climate activism, and we're seeing it with these calls to criminalise pro-Palestinian, essentially peace or anti-genocide activism right now. I'm astounded by the degree to which politicians, media figures, public figures have seemingly all intuited by now that if you really want to shut protest down, you don't just argue with it, you call it incitement and you demand new laws to illegalize the whole thing. Do you think we've grown to have a culture of like dealing with activism by demanding it all be made illegal? Or is this kind of like an attitude foisted on us by authorities,
Yeah, look, I think the history of any sort of social progress is often met with resistance, whether it comes from the state, whether it comes from the police, whether it comes from fellow citizens. That was the experience of when women were canvassing for the vote in the late 1800s, early 1900s here in Australia. They were called shrill and unintelligent people who were deeply unfit to hold any sort of high office. And yet, South Australia was one of the first places in the world to give women the vote after a long campaign. We're seeing that. We saw that with land rights and sort of any sort of mention of native title, and we're seeing that right now with climate activism. One of the things that really concern me, though, is just that this is creating a really kind of toxic environment for any sort of activism, whether it's young people taking to the streets to protest the government's inaction on climate change, whether it's the knitting nanas doing the same, or whether it's young people calling for any sort of justice. I think that because of the way that our media, particularly the mainstream media that is owned by very, very few people, they're creating a narrative that any type of protest and any type of activism is bad. We're seeing that right now with what's happening with pro-Palestine protests. So these things are in a way cyclical, but they're getting more and more dangerous because of the effects that this toxic kind of environment is had. I mean, just recently, we saw New South Wales Police arrest independent legal observers at a protest, and that is one, unethical, and two, not allowed under international law. But it's not the first time they've done it, and I'm pretty sure it won't be the last. So we're seeing that the vice, I guess, of state repression of particularly certain types of protest is getting tighter and tighter. And some of the most committed grassroots activists are paying a very, very, very high price just for asking the government to do more on climate change. It's absurd.
The declaration goes into surveillance too.
Yeah.
It's that protests shouldn't go hand in hand with surveillance. When we saw peaceful Blockade Australia protesters that are planning camp out, they discovered that they were being stalked by police disguised in woodland camo over their morning tea around the campfire, hiding in the bushes. This degree of surveillance is extraordinary. And as the declaration alludes to as well, private contractors working hand in hand with the state to surveil activists. Can't we expect the right to be able to participate in peaceful activism? And yes, I include in that civil disobedience that stops traffic, peaceful activism without being watched and documented.
Absolutely. And I think we need to be very clear that civil disobedience actions, anything that sort of is obstructive, I should say people blocking a road, those things are protected at international law as long as they remain peaceful. And peaceful doesn't mean like argy-bargy jostling. The bar for peaceful is actually quite high. It means that things stop becoming peaceful when there's like a real or an actual severe damage to property or severe injury or death to people. Like, it's a very high bar. What we're actually seeing though is that particularly with new technologies of facial recognition, mobile phone trackers, all of these things are being deployed to protest indiscriminately. So they're hoovering up data from people who are attending, from the mobile phones that are in an area where a protest is occurring. Facial recognition technology, we know that police services in Australia are using it, and they're often contracting other organisations which don't have the same human rights concerns that governments should have, to do a lot of analyzing of data. I mean, give you an example where this has a really perverse kind of effect. Is a Catholic priest was arrested about a year ago because New South Wales police, I believe, they thought that he was at a protest, and they had evidence to show that he was at a protest. Not only was he not even in New South Wales at the time, he was with other priests in Victoria. But the police knocked on his door and said, "You have been identified as being in a protest in New South Wales, and here are your charges." The man, the priest was nowhere near this protest. He wasn't even in the state at the time, and they had people to back him up on this. That was of no consequence to police because their tools told them that he was there. The problem it's absolutely unbelievable. And the problem with these technologies is that they're often wrong. And because they are used indiscriminately, and we have no way of knowing what technology is being used, where that data is going, who's viewing it, and how, we have no knowledge of this. So we're actually left in a situation where we only find out about this from these really perverse outcomes where a priest is arrested when he was nowhere near this protest. These things are very, very concerning. And going to a protest is not an invitation for police surveillance at all. And I think we need to be very clear, and a line needs to be drawn that we will not accept this because it is, we have no idea what's happening with this data, and it can be used to profile people based on race, on disability, on gender. And we know that police have a very sorry history of doing that very thing without facial recognition technology.
The declaration makes something of an exception at point 8 in terms of the right to protest for actions that could harm others. And it makes clear that this is, in part anyway, alluding to activism that hinges on hate or discrimination. I'm wondering, and I've often wondered this out loud, and I hate to run by what might come across as a reductive, slippery slope argument here, but just indulge me for a second, mate. I'm wondering about whether laws that are introduced to curtail, say, fringe far-right activism, such as Sig Heil bans and the like, only help, in a climate like the one that we've been talking about up to date, only help to establish an appetite for illegalising all kinds of fringe activism, including more legitimate protest. I guess I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, and look, that's a really, really excellent point. And we're pretty lucky, though, that international law is very clear on this issue. So the right to protest can be limited, but it can only be limited in a very narrow way and for maybe about 5 reasons. One of those is if the right to protest is being used to incite violence, national violence, racial violence, say violence towards women, these sorts of things. So the limitations on the right to protest can happen, provided they happen in accordance with law. So banning, say, for example, Nazi salutes and whatnot is compatible with human rights law, because that is one of the reasons why you can limit the right to protest. But the limitation has to be narrow. It has to be targeted. It has to be for a pressing social need. So it can't just be because someone doesn't like the message of a protest alone. And it also has to always err on allowing protest more than not, except when you get to these really quite egregious examples of, say, far-right Nazis protesting. And I'm really loath to use the term protesting, because once they actually start protesting about inciting racial violence, they've lost the right to peaceful assembly. So there is a mechanism under law to limit or restrict the right to protest, but that restriction has to always be narrow. If we're looking at blanket restrictions based on, say, a message that doesn't fall under the categories that can be restricted, then that's not compatible on its face with international law. So the right is not absolute; it can be limited, but there's already very, very strict guidelines as to how, and the politicians have to err on the side of allowing people to express their views more than not.
In recent times, we've seen police move beyond the protest space itself in kind of intimidatory efforts to quell activism. Like, I talked to Blockade Australia people who, after last year's actions, had police essentially visiting them again and again,
Mm.
harassing them in their personal lives, essentially, and sometimes even quite literally saying this to intimidate them out of
Yeah.
returning to organise. Are the police being essentially used as a tool of state governments in this way, or is this kind of this rampant over policing just the natural consequence of letting everyone view activists as criminals?
Yeah, look, I think it's a little bit of both, to be honest, Tom. So I think that the police, um, I mean, our police are incredibly militarized. They have an unbelievable amount of weapons that they can use at protest or against protesters. Everything from capsicum spray to sonar cannons to flashbang grenades and everything in between. That in and of itself is very concerning because some of these weapons are actually not even compatible with a convention against torture. But our police services have them at their disposal. What we're also seeing, and it's a very blurred line between, say, the executive government and the police and who's acting for whom. Take in South Australia, just very recently in May, some of the worst anti-protest laws were passed in that state in response to one person abseiling off one bridge for a very short period of time. But the police commissioner in South Australia expressed concern in the media that he was really upset that he could not cut the abseiling cord and just let this person just tumble to injury or death. The Premier didn't condemn those statements. Those statements were allowed on sort of talkback radio, like it's no problem. The New South Wales Police, as I mentioned already, have got no problem with arresting independent legal observers. And their rhetoric of saying that a protest is unauthorized or unlawful, that's mere nonsense. You don't need permission to protest anywhere in this country. In some places, you do need to let police know because they might need to close roads or whatnot. But that should not be a condition for enjoying the right to protest. Because these laws that have been passed all over the country give police so much discretion, it's actually becoming the police that are becoming the biggest obstruction to our enjoyment of the right to protest. In some ways more than the politicians, because the police are there on the ground and they use this very, very broad discretion. Many of them have not been trained on their human rights obligations. So you have these situations where in the Port of Botany, they just sort of lunged police horses at people. And that's not an isolated incident. So police services have a lot to account for here. And I think that we need to start looking very critically at our police services and their role in democratic communication, which is what protest is. They should have no role in democratic communication unless and until that becomes violent or there is a real risk to the safety of people. But they must allow people to express their views regardless of how they feel about them.
I want to bring up New South Wales Form 1 powers quite specifically because the final point of the declaration seems to me to quite specifically allude to that kind of thing. That's the power to essentially legalise a protest, or to more easily issue move-on orders to people for a rally for which a permit hasn't been applied. And, as I've just alluded to, that's tied to the move-on powers, basically able to tell someone to leave for any arbitrary reason, really, in practice, and if you don't, they can arrest you. Now, the Liberals in Victoria have just recently revisited the question, which was recently, they put the kibosh back in about 2014-15, but they've recently resurrected the discussion of bringing that back to Victoria in light of wanting to shut down pro-Palestinian activism. How on earth do we permit these powers to exist anywhere in Australia? And how can we get them shut down, please?
Yeah, the eternal question, and a good one. I think that so often, we talk about notification procedures, and that's usually things like putting in, New South Wales is called the Form 1, advising police that you're going to be holding an assembly. The thing is that any permit for a protest in and of itself undermines the right to protest. You should not have to ask the authorities for permission to protest the authorities on principle, but sometimes it is deeply unethical and very wrong to do so. I don't think that we should be requiring First Nations people to put in a form to the police to protest police deaths in custody. I mean, that is absurd and outrageous and wrong on every single level. International law is very clear that if you're going to have a protest permit system, it's really just about preparing a place for protest to protect the people who are going to undertake that protest. So that might be closing footpaths to make sure that people are safe, closing roads to make sure that protesters are safe. But no one and nowhere should force protest organizers to talk to the police. The police are really there to ensure the safety of everyone. They're not there to authorize protests. But what we are seeing in New South Wales is this language that police are using, that if because a Form 1 has not been put in the required way and in the time frame, that these protests are unauthorised and therefore they are unlawful. That's absolute nonsense. You are required to put in a form to notify the police in New South Wales, and if the police sort of don't accept it, it means that you might be liable to some of those charges for obstructing roads or whatnot. But it doesn't mean that your protest is unlawful. There's really the unlawful protest is a very, 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 very thin kind of category. And most of the protests that the police are talking about are not unlawful. They're just unauthorized by the police. And if you look at sort of media kind of reporting on this, and when police are pressed on whether these protests are unlawful, they can't tell you that they are because they're not. You know, the police is acting as a gatekeeper. They're not sort of facilitating a process to allow for the notification of protests. They seem to think that they're facilitating a process of permitting protests, and that is wrong on every level.
David, I'm going to put a link to the declaration, obviously, in the description to this video, because I want everyone who's watching my channel to obviously to go and give it a read and to share it around. But do you have any suggestions for how people watching can contribute to applying pressure to defend our right to protest in Australia as it continues to be eroded?
I think the number one thing is to always continuously keep on taking to the streets. These sorts of actions cannot, they are designed, they are by design. And I'm not making this up. Politicians have said this in Parliament. They are by design, they are designed rather to discourage protest, to discourage particular types of protest. And people have the right to take to the streets. They have the right to be obstructive. That is the point of protest. The point of protest in many ways is to obstruct and to get attention to an issue. So the number one thing is, if people care deeply about an issue, whatever that issue might be, go out and take to our streets. They belong to all of us. Number two, I think that we should always resist and fight back and kind of counter any of this ugly rhetoric that is sort of being bandied about by politicians, particularly that, you know, disruptive protest is the enemy. It is not. Often many of these politicians have engaged in disruptive protests, and that is the reason why they're in Parliament. But they're not willing to extend that same right and benefit to the rest of us. And I think we should always keep that in mind and remember that whenever we go to the ballot box. And the third point that I'll make is that the declaration that we've put out, it is not the maximum golden sort of protection for protests. It is the bare minimum that is required. And if at any moment we see any laws or any ugly rhetoric from any of our elected officials that is not compatible with what is in the declaration, it means that must be resisted in some way. Because whatever is being opined or proposed is not compatible with human rights law, and it does not affirm our right to protest. So those are the sort of three main points. Go out there and protest and take to the streets in a way that is peaceful and compatible with human rights law. Make sure that we resist any sort of attempt to demonize our right to protest, and use the declaration as a bit of a measuring tool to make sure that that we're actually expanding our democracy, not closing down public spaces for us to be able to voice our views.
I get a lot of scrappy sort of activist voices around this channel, and it's often that kind of a scrappy activist perspective. But it's just really, really nice to speak to someone with an authoritative but principled legal take on all this kind of thing. And I'm really, really grateful, as I'm sure everyone else watching is, for the declaration and for all your hard work. So thanks again so much for your time, David.
Thanks, Tom. It's an absolute pleasure.
And thanks, of course, to all you legends for watching. See yous next week, but in the meantime, if you want to support the work that I do, you can always chuck me a clam at patreon.com/TomTaniki. Cheers.